Adobe Digital Editions. Star book content text. But the surface was slippery and it was getting increasingly difficult to keep my footing. Finally, I had no choice and grabbed the rope. The person maintained the tension on the rope as I carefully climbed up. I stopped to take a breath and calm my anxiety. It's an opportunity, LM, the voice said. I looked up, and it was Barkan. It's an opportunity, he repeated and threw his end of the rope over the edge behind me. I sat up on my pallet, bathed in sweat. I instinctively knew it was late, and that I had to hurry to get dressed and meet Hans at the main entrance. I had agreed to go on a hike with him up the Mandurah volcano. I hoped that my dream had no connection to the day's activity. As I was leaving the residence, I looked toward the eyepiece in the wall. Something in me didn't want to know what was happening on the other side. But it was my work, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. It was also in my interest to know, especially if the dream, as I suspected, was connected in some way to Malady EK. I looked, but the room was empty. "I've been told that this way has the greatest views," Hans said as he set a vigorous pace up the trail. It was clear that he was an experienced climber, and I followed, taking special care negotiating the broken lava rock and twisting roots. The density of the planet's atmosphere and the chilling dampness made the climb more taxing than I had expected. Finally we came to a clearing that afforded the view of the Mandurah Valley rising up to a volcanic range of mountains, which floated above the bluish mist. Thankfully, there was direct sunshine that warmed the rocks we sat upon and helped to dispel the forest chill. "This reminds me of my part of Earth," Hans said as we gazed out over the valley. He explained that everyone in his family loved to climb and hike. If we managed to come to an agreement, many people from Earth would come here to vacation. I assume Carter Science would also visit Oakham and Dorvan if there were peace between our peoples. No question. We tend to stay within the limits of our union. Except where resources are involved, Hans said cheerfully, watching carefully for my reaction. "What would you have us do? Cardassia is not a rich place like Earth. We have to live." I was equally cheerful in my reply. "Everyone has the right to live, Alardig. But does it have to be at the expense of others? If that's the competition, so be it. Very often, Hans, the game is about survival. But surely there's another way of dealing with scarcity than forcibly occupying another homeland and reducing its people to the level of vassals and slaves." Hans continued to smile, and I wondered if he really believed these sentiments, or was this another example of Federation hypocrisy. These people reduced all political complexity to pious platitudes, while they constructed the greatest empire in the history of the Alpha Quadrant. "Have I been brought to this beautiful place to be subjected to a critique of our Bajoran policy?" Hans laughed and looked out to the distant mountains. As the sun moved behind some clouds, a cold wind kicked up. When he turned back he was no longer smiling. "Your brother is not well. I'm sure you know that." I took a long breath and nodded. "He hasn't been well for a while." I wasn't sure where this was going, but it felt right. "Then you're concerned about his welfare?" "We all are. The art is to thread and extend meaning, using as few words as possible." "Is he getting the help he needs? So concerned, so caring." I took another long breath. "Well, it's difficult in our culture." I shrugged. "Is that why he came to us?" "Yes," I answered immediately, instinctively feeling that any hesitation would alert him to my ignorance and subsequent scramble for footing. I looked Hans in the eyes and resisted being swallowed by their immeasurable blue depths. I shivered against the cold. Hans saw this. I couldn't pretend that it hadn't happened. Book content text. "He's not a traitor. But he needs help. I told him not to go to you, that we'd find a way." I trailed off, translating my ignorant isolation into that of someone caught between two powerful forces. Tears came to my eyes, and I marveled that I had absolutely no emotional attachment to them. "We know he's not a traitor. When Sark came to us and explained the situation, he made it clear that your brother had no other recourse." "Yes, the Vulcan." "Careful now." Another breath. "That's true," I replied. "What usually happens to people in your culture who suffer from a mental imbalance?" Hans was now treading delicately. Clearly, they needed my help with Malady EK. I wondered if he had really gone to them, or if they had enticed him in some way. Or was this all a lie? "We kill them?" Something very sharp emerged from the blue depth of Hans's eyes, and for the first time I was afraid I had gone too far. But it was too late to back down. I had to rely on human prejudice. Cowardice and madness are unforgivable, I went on. They reflect flaws in the Cardassian character that can never be redeemed. This was to a certain extent indeed true of cowardice. Madness, however, was looked upon as a mysterious disease, and those who suffered were isolated and treated well. In any event, no one was killed unless the cowardice occurred in battle. My God, Hans breathed, confirming, I'm sure, his belief that we were capable of any kind of atrocity. I hated his self-righteous superiority, and calculated the several moves that would send him flying into the abyss. Instead I turned and sat down on a rock that still held warmth from the departed sun. I put my head in my hands to give him the impression of my utter vulnerability. So, alarmed. What do we do now? Father had hoped that if he brought Becom on this trip got him away from home and the pressures, but it's only gotten worse. Father can't even concentrate on his work. We never should have come here. I'm afraid. I stopped as if I'd gone too far. Of what? He asked. I just shook my head. I understand, Hans said, thinking that he had me. There was a long silence. We'll take care of Becom. You have my word. I think I know the way. I looked at him, full of gratitude. Thank you, Hans. But we will need your participation. I am going to set up a meeting as soon as possible. With Becom? I asked, hiding my concern. No. With the people who are helping him. Anything I can't do. I assured him with heartfelt sincerity. I know. Well. Hans looked around, smiling again. We'd better get back before we lose the light. As we came down the trail, I wondered about Malady Ek and his illness, the people who were helping him, and the exact nature of my participation. That night I reported to Liger, and he checked and double-checked every detail I had related with probing specific questions. I assumed that it was because the situation had reached the critical point and he was concerned that a probe was in the middle. But the discomforting thought did occur to me, as I patiently responded to his interrogation, that he was also scrutinizing my veracity. I was about to ask him if he doubted what I was reporting, when he preempted me. I may put you on the enhancer. I said nothing. It was enough of a challenge just to return his look. How would you feel about that? He asked. I would submit, of course. Is there something you're not telling me? LM? Note. I continued to hold his look and knew better than to ask him anything now. I would only appear defensive. I waited in the long silence, and refused to back down. Consult your compship. There is some information I want you to pass on to Hans Jort when you see him next. I was dismissed. Book content text. Hans contacted me 2 days later, and we took another hike up the Mandara. Once again he set the group a link pace on a different, steeper trail. As I struggled to keep up, it occurred to me that breaking me down physically was certainly a part of his strategy. When we stopped to admire the view, Hans's sentimental expression, I didn't try to hide my exhaustion. I flopped down, panting heavily, and giving the not untrue impression that I couldn't go any further. Are you all right, alarmed? Hans asked, barely showing any effects at all of the arduous hike. I nodded. He watched me as I struggled with my breathing. He took a small instrument from his pocket and waved it over me. I was warned by Liger to deactivate my compship, because Hans would check to see if I was recording the conversation. He was satisfied that I was. We've found someone who can help Becom. I nodded again, pretending that it was still too difficult for me to speak. But to give him the help he needs, we're going to need some information. I waited for Hans to continue. He speaks of betrayal, and he mentions you. Me. I didn't have to feign surprise. Yes. Why would he say that about his own brother? Hans asked. I don't know. And I didn't know how to reply to this. What else did he say about me? He told us not to believe anything you tell us. According to him, you're here to pass on misinformation regarding the Cardassian position, and you represent an intelligence agency that wants to scuttle these talks. He says that you're not even his brother. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What did Malady Ek think he could accomplish by telling them this? Was this his revenge for what happened at Bamaran? Or was this another example of having only the information I needed for the moment? I had no choice but to stay with my story. I didn't even try to hide my true confusion from Hans. Are you a spy? He asked. No. And I really don't know what there is to spy about. The negotiating positions seem to be common knowledge. Troop withdrawals from the neutral zone. Unarmed observers on all planets in question to monitor the truce and withdrawal. Cardassian control of Dorvan. These are the main points. What's left are the details. This was an accurate summation. Hans thought for a moment. You're well informed. I am here to work with my father and learn. And I thought Becom was as well. Unless. Unless what? Hans asked. Unless he's playing a dangerous game. No one pretends that a settlement with the Federation has unanimous support of the Central Command. There are elements in the military who'd like to see these talks fail. I'm just afraid that Becom may have gotten involved with them. So now you're accusing each other. Hans was skeptical. But why would he say such a thing about me? I asked fervently. He hasn't been well ever since he came back from Bamaran. And Bamaran is ? Our state security school. He suffered a terrible humiliation there, and I know he wants to do something that will somehow erase the shame. I'm afraid he's involved in something that's way over his head. He's playing some kind of game with you, Hans, and I think he's trying to impress someone. Who? Hans asked. Father, I said, as if finally understanding. Father always expected that Becom would be the one who'd go to the Diplomatic Institute and follow in his steps. When Becom went to Bamaran, Father was hurt and turned to me. Ever since, he's been trying to prove to Father that he made the right choice, but after the fiasco at Bamaran. I nodded vigorously, kicking up dust as I paced our small clearing. I don't know what he's telling you, Hans, but if it's anything like what he's said about me, then be careful. He's angry and he's disturbed, and he's going to say whatever he feels he needs to redeem his pride and honor. He's always been an adventurer, and this whole spy business I'm certain is just another game to him. Book content text. Hans didn't say anything. He looked out over his beloved rainforests receding to the distant string of volcanoes, and his face was a mask. What was the information you wanted from me? I asked after a long silence. Hans grimaced as if to dispel an unpleasant thought. No, Alardig, I think you've told me what's necessary, he said with formal politeness. I hope it's of use in helping Becom. I think this is a family matter, don't you? Becom and his father need to sort things out. If only they could, Hans, I said with a sigh. We traced our way back down the volcano. I never saw Hans Jort again. I reported to Leimer that evening. As I gave him every word, gesture, and detail, he never took his eyes off of mine. After I had finished, I sat in silence while he made some notes on a comm chip that seemed to come out of his hand. The silence deepened as he waited for what I guessed to be a reply to his notes. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, but by now I knew that I was only going to get the information I needed to proceed and nothing more. I had no idea as to what Malady EK was up to, and I was worried about my improvisation that afternoon with Hans. Leimer looked up from the comm chip. You will return to Cardassian tomorrow morning. Stay in your quarters until someone comes for you, and be ready to leave immediately. Leimer's tone was flatter than usual, and I was worried even more that somehow I had botched my assignment, whatever that assignment had been. I nodded and moved to the door. You did well, he said in the same flat tone. It was amazing how quickly and completely my spirits changed. But tonight you are to leave your comm chip on, so I can hear everything in your room. Do you understand? I wasn't sure if I did. Yes, of course, I assured him. Leimer just looked at me. Stay on your toes, Elim. This assignment is not over. The first thing I did when I returned to my room was to check the eyepiece, but Malady EK wasn't in his room. I wondered if he would ever return. Had he gone over to the Federation? Had they murdered him? My imagination was attempting to fill in the missing pieces. What was this about? I packed my things to be ready in the morning, and sat in a chair fully clothed with my phaser concealed but accessible. I adjusted the comm chip so that Leimer could monitor. What I was waiting for I wasn't quite sure, but I had an idea. Asterisk. There were all kinds of eyes staring at me. Strange blue ones that studied me like a specimen. Soft brown ones that signaled regret. Hard red eyes that looked at me with unaccountable hatred. I opened my eyes, and the red eyes were still staring at me. They belonged to Malady EK, bloodshot with an inner torment I had only witnessed through the eyepiece. I realized that I had fallen asleep. How long had he been in the room? Malady EK. What? I started to get up, but he pushed me back. I didn't resist, because I saw that he had a small phaser in his hand, and I was better off in the chair anyway because that's where my phaser was. When I saw you at the cell meeting I knew you were nothing but trouble. Just as before. His deadly tone sent my hand for the phaser, but I couldn't find it. Malady EK, I have never meant you any ill. From the beginning. With Sharaban. You were an instrumental part of my betrayal. What betrayal? I asked. It was the competition, and it was my duty to fight you and try to win. But you weren't supposed to win. He shouted, raising the hand with the phaser. I still couldn't find mine. It must have slipped deeper into the cushions. Of course we were. Wind is the obligation of any Cardassian. I didn't know what he was talking about. He laughed with that loud, unpleasant bark. Book content text. You're good, aren't you? They sent me back. They said I wasn't stable enough to trust. They said I should work it out with my father. He laughed again. If they only knew. What did you tell them? Tell who? I asked. He played with me again. He raised the phaser and moved toward me. I wondered if Limer was hearing this. Twice is enough. 10 blew back. Another bark. A 10. He said with splitting disgust. You threw that body at us and I knew Sharaban wasn't keeping his end of the bargain. What bargain? I suddenly didn't care about the phaser. You don't know, do you? No. It was supposed to end in a stalemate. Neither of us would win. That way, Sharaban could still assume leadership, and my placement after culmination would have been higher than an obsidian probe. He suddenly looked at me as if he was seeing another person. Why did you leave Bamaran? He demanded. I was told to, I replied. Why? He couldn't compute this. You were one of the unit leaders. You should have advanced with the betrayer. I said nothing. I was not about to explain my own betrayal. Malady EK began to weep. What did you say to them? You said something about my father. Somehow I knew he wasn't talking about Unal. I told them that you were in over your head and that it was because you were trying to prove something to your father. His eyes were suddenly furious, and he grabbed my neck with his free hand and held the phaser up to my head. What do you know? What do you know about anything? He screamed in my face. I easily grabbed the wrist of his phaser hand and disarmed him and kicked him back onto the floor. I stood up and held the phaser so he could see it. I wasn't sure, but I thought I heard footsteps moving away from the door outside. What am I going to tell him? They're sending me back. You seem to know everything that's going on in my life. How do I tell him I've been disgraced again? What do I say? The look on his face, the red eyes and contorted muscles sent chills through me. He actually expected me to give him an answer. Just tell him. You did the best you could. The bark this time shocked me. It was loud and mocking and had a concussive effect. I backed up, fully expecting him to attack. Instead, he walked to the door, opened it and left. I didn't follow him. I was too stunned by the last grotesque image he'd presented. I went to the eyepiece, but he didn't return to his room. I didn't know what to do. Somehow the fiction, created in a moment of need, had become blended in with an awful reality, and I felt that once again I'd been the unwilling instrument of Malady EK's abysmal failure. Come in, Elim. Tane had his uncle smile working today. I entered the office, which was more cluttered than ever. There was barely room for me to stand. We did very well on Bun. I hope my contribution. Yes, we were able to scuttle those misconceived talks. We complained that the Federation was more interested in harassing our embassy people than they were in bargaining in good faith. I nodded. There were so many questions. How I had managed to function during that mission, when I never knew what it was about or what I was supposed to do, I'll never know. This was my first experience with Tane's working methods. For him it was all a puzzle, and we were the separate pieces he put together at his pleasure. I had to accept that the final result, destroying the talks, was the one he wanted. But there was one question I needed to ask. Malady EK's final look haunted me still. What is it, Elim? Tane asked. What happened to Malady EK? You didn't hear? He seemed surprised. A terrible thing really. He killed himself. I didn't move a muscle. I felt my throat begin to constrict. Book content text. Very upsetting. It was the reason the talks were cancelled. We had no idea he was so unstable. That was the word the Federation had used. Then they sent him back. And while I believe that Hans Georg had decided that Malady EK was too much of a liability, Tane's Thundling King look made it clear to me that this was a far more complicated world than that of Bamaran and the competition. For one thing, the penalty for losing could be fine. For another, we can never be certain what purpose we are serving. At least Malady EK didn't have to worry about what he would say to his father now. Menu with